Thank you, Thomas. And I am very happy to be here, to be moderating this panel, which is very close to my heart. The questions of multilingualism, questions of identity and integration and belonging are becoming more and more important in all of our societies, in Estonia, but for everyone who has come from any other country. And it doesn't matter how multicultural, multilingual is your society, but in the globalized world, we don't have borders for languages, and we don't have borders for information coming in different languages. So I'm very looking forward to the 3 presentations that will be happening now and the discussion after. I hope we have sufficient time to cover these questions from different angles. So as our first speaker, I would like to invite Nayr Correia Ibrahim. She's an associate professor of English subject pedagogy at Nayr University in Bodø, Norway. And Nayr's interests include early language learning, or multilingualism, multiple literacies, and language and identity. In her presentation, she will focus on developing multilingual mindset within a language rights perspective, with specific focus on questions of belonging and also with making us, together with her, understand what is the importance of multilingual mindset and multilingual identity. Please, Nayr.
Right. Thank you very much to the organizers, first of all, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here today. I'm going to talk about multilingualism, identity, mindsets, language rights, but I'm going to focus on children. And I'm going to focus on children being bilingual, on children becoming multilingual, integrating new communities, acquiring new languages, and a new self in a safe and positive learning environment. That's what we actually want to encourage education contexts to become. So how can education create friendly spaces and give children the gift of multilingualism and the gift of maintaining their language identities? And our question is, are we actually doing that now or not? There seem to be some positive areas where multilingualism is actually being encouraged. And if you look at the key competences for lifelong learning that were revised between 2016 and 2018 by the EU, they started off with language separation. So first you have communication in the mother tongue, and the second competence was communication in foreign languages. But when we looked at that, we obviously realized that they did not reflect the reality and how children actually function in multilingual societies today. So the new revised version looks like this. And it is very interesting to see that one of the competences has become multilingual, a multilingual competence. And the other competence, the second one, is literacy. So there is a focus on recognizing, acknowledging, and supporting children's multilingual repertoires, but also the important focus on literacy. Because when children come into school, and newly arrived children in particular contexts come into the school system, they have to learn to read and write in their multiple languages. And ideally, they will also learn to read and write in their mother tongue, so that they become multilingual and multiliterate in the languages that they know. There also seems to be some kind of positive attitudes in the newspapers. So this is a research that was conducted in Brussels with about 4,200 primary school children, and we found out that that children actually speak more than one language at home. About 50% of children speak more than one language at home. If you add the local languages, if you add the school languages, these children are multilingual. And the discourse in this particular article is actually quite positive. It encourages us to leave the monolinguistic vision behind. Here is another example where the title is quite positive. So children who speak English as a second language are more likely to improve in primary school. However, when you look inside, there are some actually interesting sentences that I like to focus on. And this is the first one. Some very bright children come to this country or are born to immigrants. And I thought, only some? Are children born to immigrants not bright? So, and I thought that was a little bit patronizing, being the daughter of immigrants myself. Another one, the title, the headline looks quite positive. So statewide tests, so ELLs, English language learners in the United States, they're doing quite well in their statewide tests. However, let's look inside again. And the first sentence, it's a surprising finding. Why is it still surprising today that children who are learning a new language and picking up a new language are actually capable of learning that language and excelling at it? I think it's because we are still looking at children and we are still looking at education through the monolingual mindset. Therefore, we are incapable of acknowledging the potential that multilingualism actually gives society and these children. Sometimes the discourse is downright negative. And this is an interesting, another newspaper article, 2014, this is the 21st century, in Luxembourg, an officially multilingual country, where the children are being punished for speaking their mother tongue. And this isn't just children, these are 3- and 4-year-olds in kindergarten. And this is the language this is their emotional language, is their affective language. It's the language is their bedside story language. It's the language that they are comforted in when they are sick, when they fall and hurt themselves. So I think today, despite the fact that we accept that multilingualism is a fact, it's the norm, the discourse is still through the monolingual lens. And therefore, children's languages are at best ignored, still, and at worst, explicitly discriminated against, as in this example. So we need to move towards a multilingual mindset, and these phrases are actually very interesting in how they describe monolingualism as the illiteracy of the 21st century, an affliction of the powerful, the real linguistic deficiency, a figment of the imagination, a myth detached from reality because the reality on the ground is multilingual, and a waste of our biological linguistic potential. I'd like to add an invisibility cloak, because I think that we are not looking at multilinguals, and especially multilingual children, as multilingual individuals. We're looking at them through the monolingual lens, because the monolingual approach and bias that we still function with in society is actually blocking our vision and is blocking the way that we should be functioning, and we should be helping these children develop their multilingualism, and therefore their multilingual identity as well. But why is this? I mean, multilingualism is a challenge. It is not easy, because it's also messy. And I suppose in a bit more academic language, it is a complex, dynamic, and multidimensional phenomenon. It includes all of these elements, and it's fuzzy because they interact with each other, they interlinked, they impact on each other. So if we move from, I just wanted to give an example from my own personal experience, and it is actually a personal anecdote of how multilingualism actually functions in reality. And this was my father's 70th birthday. We were in Paris in a Portuguese restaurant, and we were having lunch using 4 different languages, because there are 4 different languages in the family. So I'd just like to show you how this conversation went. Whoops, sorry, I'm going back. So my parents speak Portuguese, and we always speak Portuguese to them. So he says about his veal, his roast veal, "A vitela assada está muito boa." He liked it. So I turned to my husband, and we speak English all the time. So my dad likes the vitela, what do you think? And he agrees, it's really good. He turns around to my brother-in-law, but they are both Arabic speakers. So in Arabic, they say to each other, "El bitelo helwa." Aywa, my brother-in-law agrees. My brother-in-law and my sister speak French at home. So they turn to each other and speak French. "Oh, tu veux goûter le veau? C'est très bon ici." And then my sister turns to my mother. Posso provare vitella? Because that's always a language we've spoken to our parents. I turn to my son. That's the language we use at home with him. Karim, do you also want some vitella? Always switching. And it's important that the word vitella always appears in Portuguese because my mother was the cook in the house. And language around food and cooking is very Portuguese. So he turns around switching between English and French as he does all the time. No, c'est bon, my steak frit's fine. Now, I wouldn't have written this down if the waitress, who was actually looking at us and very strangely, suddenly mustered the courage to ask us, so, vocês estão a falar quantas línguas? How many languages are you speaking? So we were speaking 4 languages, having a perfectly normal conversation. We were not translating either. We were actually just translanguaging. So that's how multilingual communication functions. And in this particular case, we are actually foregrounding our multilingual identity by being able to use these 4 languages in this particular context. So we need to deconstruct multilingualism, and I think we need to demonolingualize discourse so that we instinctively talk about plurality and diversity and that our discourse becomes more inclusive. We need to demonolingualize perspectives so that we develop a more holistic view of multilingualism and we treat individuals as multilinguals from the onset. We need to demonolingualize language so that we stop objectifying language into separate boxes and separate entities. We need to demonolingualize education and include translanguaging and multilanguaging as inherent classroom practices and therefore enhance deeper learning and help teachers understand these different strategies. We need to demonolingualize the self. The inner self, who I am as a multilingual, the outer self, how I present myself as a multilingual. And I think we need to talk more about multilingualism in schools. I don't think we do enough of that. We need to make our multilingualism visible, and we need to be proud of our multilingual identity. There is a call for the multilingual turn, which recognizes multilingualism as the norm, which recognizes multilingual repertoires and the fact that we are living in super diverse societies, and it also recognizes how languages develop over our own histories, in that languages sometimes develop with us, sometimes we leave languages behind us. So multilingualism isn't something that is, it's not linear as we would like it to be. But we need to add identity to the multilingual turn, because multilingualism, using children's different languages in an educational context, should not just be a scaffolding approach. Right, I need to help this child learn that language. I'm going to use a word from Estonian just to help them learn the language. It should be about acknowledging their plurilingual identities. It should be about contributing to their social, emotional, and well-being, and as a recognition of their children's agency in how they prefer to learn and in the languages that they would like to learn, they would like to use in order to help them learn. We are not giving them these choices in education. Identity is also about negotiating. It's about negotiating who you are at that particular moment in time. Because as Bonnie Norton states, languages, the role of language as constitutive of and as constituted by language learners' social identity is an important aspect to remember. I'm sitting in front of you speaking English. I was introduced as an associate professor of English subject pedagogy. I have met one of my colleagues from my previous work at the British Council, and yet you may have discovered that my mother tongue is Portuguese. So perhaps I'm foregrounding my Englishness, but there is more to me than just that. The work that I have done with children on language and identity, or multilingualism and identity, has shown me that the links, the connections that children make to their languages depend on the people who speak the languages to them, the places where these languages are used, and also the experiences that children have in these languages. So the question should be, are we speaking our languages to our children? What are the spaces that we are creating for language use and language interaction to exist? And what experiences are we giving our children in those different languages for them to connect to the language? The interesting thing is, though, that even though children were very clear about who I speak that language to, so I speak Russian to my father and French to my mother, when you ask them to explain, you actually realize that their communication was actually a lot more multilingual than that. They may be speaking French to their mother and then switch to English. So there's always this pull between needing to be identified as a French speaker because I can speak French, I'd like to be seen as a French speaker, but at the same time wanting to be given the opportunity to also be multilingual when I have to be multilingual, when I need to switch between languages. So the pull between this physical, unique, negotiating between a physical and unique space, language space, and then a much more overlapping and complex language space. Children are constantly moving between the two. There's also some very interesting work being done at Cambridge University through a project called MATE, so Multilingualism, Engaging Individuals, Transforming Societies in the UK, where they're looking at conceptualizing multilingual identity as participative. You need to participate in the language, in developing that identity in order to develop that multilingual mindset. And the words that I find interesting in this quote are explicit, participative, active, conscious. So it needs to become visible in order for it to become possible. And I'd just like you, there's also a very interesting work being done on visualizing multilingual lives or visualizing multilingualism, or calling for a visual turn in research in multilingualism. So you actually get participants in research to draw their languages as opposed to just talk about their languages. I would like to call for a visual turn in pedagogy as well, in order for us to get children involved in drawing and expressing their languages through multiple creative means, as opposed to just talking about their languages. And I'd like to show you some examples of work that we've done with children around this visualizing multilingual identity. But before we even go there, you, as the educator, as the parent, as the teacher, you need to expose yourself. You need to be multilingual, and you need to be proud of being multilingual and tell the children, tell your students that you are multilingual. And that's me. That's me being multilingual. All the different connections I have with my languages, the languages I've learned, the organizations I've worked for. My very latest is the Very Hungry Caterpillar in Norwegian, because I am now trying to learn Norwegian. Now, when I work with teachers and I do a session on multilingualism, this is what I show them, this is who I am. And the interesting thing is that teachers went away and did the same thing. So on the right, this is a language map. So we had worked with language maps in our professional development course, and the teacher went away, she drew her own language map, and you can see all the different languages that she's got on there. And then she presented this language map to her grade 7 class, so 12-year-olds. And they produced their own language maps. Now you can see that there's a kind of a mirror image of the teacher's language map. But the children were actually quite positive about this experience because they were able to describe and talk about and express this language identity through visual means. And I particularly like this one because this language journey does not end. The child says, "To be continued." And I think that is absolutely wonderful that this child intends to learn more languages. Multilingual repertoires. We need to put this on the table literally. And this is what we did. We looked at, okay, what languages do you know? Not necessarily just the language that you speak or read and write, but the ones you know. And then we were playing around with our languages. Okay, which are our dominant language what is our dominant language constellation? That is, the languages that I use on a regular basis, that perhaps I need to use in this particular context. And here you've got mine and a teacher's. And then you're able to have discussions about why these choices are made. Another example that some of you may know is the language silhouette. And these language silhouettes are actually brilliant because they don't just talk about your history, they really do go deep down into how you experience language emotionally, so therefore your language identity. And this one was particularly amazing because this child drew the inner organs of her body. So language is visceral. It is something that is connected to her even physiologically. And these are some of the comments that she wrote about her different languages. I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to bring them up on the slide. But the one thing that I actually found really interesting about these comments is the metaphor, the metaphorical language that the child is using. This was a research I did with 14-year-olds. And so how the child is actually trying to express this identity through metaphor. Another example is objects. I've also used objects quite a lot because objects connect people to their experiences. And it is interesting that they don't just connect people to the actual cultural space that objects are supposed to come from. So if we use this example on the screen, you would, I think, inevitably associate these two objects with the Middle East, am I right? Well, the child who actually chose these two objects was a Spanish, French, and English speaker. So can you connect these objects to one of those languages? Oops, going back. No, English. Simply because this child learned English in an international kindergarten in Dubai. And it was the child's connection to English will forever be the desert and camels and this part of the world, not the green moors of England. So that's how these objects, they give you the opportunity of decentering the whole language discourse and looking at the reality of how children use their languages. Just one more example. This is a school in Ireland, and fantastic work that a head teacher, Deirdre Cohen, did in the school, where she opened up the language space to multiple languages. And this includes English and Irish, but also the children's heritage language. And in this example, you've got the child writing the same text in English, Irish, and Hungarian, her heritage language. So even at literacy level, once you open up the school system to languages, the children also were learning each other's languages through poems and songs, etc. So, in order to develop a multilingual identity mindset, we can do that by making children's languages and plurilingual skills visible, by including discussion around children's languages and language use in the classroom, acknowledging children's language repertoires as a positive contribution to language learning, developing children's awareness of languages, of other languages in the classroom, and therefore opening up an intercultural discussion around language. Sustaining and validating children's multilingual identity, exploring language connections, differences, similarities, roots, families, and teaching multilingual strategies, such as language modes, translanguaging, multilanguaging, metalinguistic and pragmatic awareness, so that children can learn to be plurilingual. And I just want to finish with this drawing, because I think it's actually a wonderful drawing from a 13-year-old in my research. She wrote her 5 languages in the actual script. She on the side, so I love you, in her different 5 languages. She also expresses what her languages are for her. They are my confidence, my proudness, my pride, achievement, my difference from other, my power. And I think the most important thing is that this power is visible in her drawing because she's actually holding the world in her hand. So it is by giving children a multilingual voice that we acknowledge their multilingual identity and we give them a multilingual power. Thank you. Aikos.
Thank you very much, Nayr, and we will come back with, I hope, a lot of questions. later during discussion. And next I would like to invite Sari Pöyhönen, who is a professor of applied linguistics and deputy head of department at the Center of Applied Language Studies, University of Jyväskylä. And Sari's research and writing focuses on language, identity and belonging, minorities and language rights, also migration, asylum and settlement. And in her talk, Sari will take a bit more personal approach and using a personal story and journey of Mohammed, as I understand, a person who came to Finland as an asylum seeker, will speak based on his experience about what challenges people face in the context of monolingual integration training and in the context of their multilingual lives, and what kind of challenges they need to negotiate in order to integrate in the new society. Sari, please.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful introduction, and thank you, Nayr, you did brilliant job. Introduction of identity, belonging, and multilingualism. So many people in this room today have said that I'd like to represent something different, a different angle, and perhaps I do the same. So I'm borrowing other people's notions on this. So I would be focusing on Finland's official bilingualism and how it's implemented or interpreted and understood when migrants, new arrivals, are trying to find their place in a new country. And what does this have to do with their actual multilingual lives? And I propose challenges for integration policies. I'm a true believer of stories, so not just me as a researcher doing my job in talking. I'm also an ethnographer, so that's why I use this kind of approach. And why swans? Well, it's a national bird of Finland, but also birds don't have borders. Okay, let's start. Bilingual Finland has an international reputation as something of a model country with well-functioning bilingual legislation. It is quite common to start a country report or a research paper by stating that according to Finnish legislation, Finland is a bilingual country with two national languages, Finnish and Swedish. This is of course a fact. But I have to add that official bilingualism as features in the Finnish government programs for over 100 years is actually defined as societal bilingualism rather than individual bilingualism. This means that state, the nation, and the bilingual municipalities consist of two groups of speakers of Finnish and Swedish, which are inherently monolingual. A formal statement of equality in Finnish law, however, does justice neither to the relationship between Swedish and Finnish on the ground, nor to the complexities involved for migrants, particularly asylum seekers, as they attempt to gain access to one, other, or both languages in process of settlement or integration, if you will. Therefore, what also counts is how official bilingualism policy is interpreted, how it's confirmed, and most importantly, how it's contested in various domains by various stakeholders, by national authorities, by education providers, by working life, by individuals. So in this paper, I focus on asylum seekers who are awaiting the decision on their asylum claim in Swedish-dominant area of Finland. By focusing on asylum seekers' lived experiences, I interrogate themes of official bilingualism and majority, minority language use, also bearing in mind that migration in general and forced migration and settlement in particular are inherently complex, using the researcher's word, complex individual, social, societal, and political processes. So I'm not going to offer any simple solutions, sorry to say. My insights derive from a linguistic team ethnography, a project that we have called Jag bor I Oravais. I live in Oravais. This project took place in and around a reception center for people seeking asylum in Finland. We started in 2015, and officially we have ended in 2018, but we are still continuing with some of the key participants. So you can see that it's a truly longitudinal study. Some of the people have been deported, they have vanished, they have received asylum, or they have ended up being undocumented. So all possible varieties of decisions are at stake. Finland was that time a country that received over 10 times more asylum claims in 2015 than the previous year, so over 32,000. And we have these two larger aims of the project. Firstly, we explore the ways people seeking asylum tell about their everyday lives at and around the reception center while they are waiting for a decision on their asylum claim. It usually takes about a year, but the process can take up to 3 or even 6 years. So that's why I live in Oravais. And secondly, we analyze the significance of Swedish and Finnish and discuss these lived experiences in relation to wider political and social structures, such as asylum policy, integration, employment, and official bilingualism. I will continue from this. I'm a bit worried about the time. So the reception center is located in the northwest of Finland, in a small rural municipality in a Swedish-dominant region, and far away from the populous Helsinki metropolitan area. But it's also one of the oldest reception centers, established in 1991. The unemployment rate in this particular region is the lowest in Finland, and this region is also famous for emigrating to Sweden, to North America, to Australia. So basically everyone has some sort of a direct or indirect experience of being a migrant, either through their own experiences or through their family members. The picture over here is the official website of this particular municipality, and it shows that, and one of the young people said that there are only tractors, you see. In Finland, a requirement for proficiency in one of the national languages is embedded in law for new arrivals when hoping to settle in the country. This is not a Finland-specific phenomenon. By 2016, 78% of Council of Europe member countries had some kind of legal language requirement for settlement or citizenship. As with elsewhere also, national programs of integration and adult language education in Finland do not take into account people awaiting the outcome of an asylum claim. Such people in a liminal position without a full official status are viewed by the state policy actors as not yet being members of wider society, as perhaps never being members of the society, or even as having embarked upon a process of integration. So they are not included in the provisions of the Integration Act. Asylum seekers in Finland are nonetheless required to engage in education or to work. And education usually in this sense means some weekly lessons of Finnish language and general information about Finnish society. This low intensity provision can be organized by an initial reception center, like in Oravais, with trained teachers or volunteers, or by another educational institution mandated by a reception center. The methods, materials, training, background of teachers, and overall quality of language education for asylum seekers does vary greatly across reception centers in the country. And provision is not bound by the national core curricula for integration training for adult migrants, which is reserved for permanent residents. So language education in Finnish is provided even in the Swedish-dominant areas of the country, including the municipality where our research is located in Oravais. An assumption is made by the state authorities that even if an asylum seeker is housed in a Swedish-dominant area, they could not regard this as the final destination. An equal assumption holds that even if the asylum claim happens to be successful, the applicant will move to cities such as Helsinki or Tampere, where the use of Finnish is more widespread, even though the city might be officially bilingual. When taken as a whole, the state's purpose in providing language education for asylum seekers in Finland appears very contradictory. On one hand, their language lessons are not intended to support their integration. Far from it, because as asylum seekers, they are not yet on an official pathway to integration or settlement. But the language instruction they do receive is in Finnish rather than Swedish, even if they are housed in Swedish-dominant areas of the country. If successful in their claim for asylum, it is supposed also that they will eventually, as I said, move to Finnish-dominant region. There are also lack of resources. There's a lot of misunderstandings by local authorities of the needs for proficiency in Swedish in the area. But it is not only to think critically about local authorities, also the state has something to say. Even official literature for migrants discourages the choice of Swedish as the language of integration. This quotation is from 2012 edition of the Welcome to Finland brochure, which is given to all arrivals, and it reads, "Finland is a bilingual country. Its official languages are Finnish and Swedish. Integrating in Finland will be easier if you can speak the language of the municipality of residence. Learning the language of new home country is vital. It will be easier for you to find a job if you know Finnish. Some 5% of Finnish people speak Swedish as their native language. And in this particular case in Oravais, some 5% of Finnish speakers have Finnish as their mother tongue." It obviously caused a huge debate, and the next year the tone of voice changed somewhat, or in 2018. The same document. Swedish language integration may be a good choice for you if you live in an area with many Swedish speakers. You have family members or relatives who speak Swedish. You already speak some Swedish. And then there's an explanation about, however, what you should do, and obviously you have the right to choose. And this has something to do with the neoliberal understanding of the right to choose. If you choose wrongly, it's your personal mistake. We have warned you. It's the position in these discourses, these official texts, which are binding by the law. Swedish is really ambivalent, and the language is still presented as the second and the more risky choice. I would also like to add that the concept of integration, which is a key concept in this conference, it's often used in policy making, and it's a very tricky one. And I'd like to add, it's very political and politicized concept, and interpreted in various ways if you compare different nation states or different actors. The concept is also widely criticized in wide spectrum of migration research. For example, sociologist John Arry has noted that various types of mobility raise the question concerning integration, namely, integration into what? Societies are increasingly complex, and migration is one of those phenomena that makes us rethink the meanings of typical social categories, such as gender, such as religion, language, to start with. After this quite long introduction, I will focus now on lived experience of Mohammed, who chose this name for this particular research. I met with him for the first time in September 2015 when he had just arrived to Finland with his oldest son and has been in Finland for 1 month and living in this particular reception center. He's around 50 years old. He's a Sunni Muslim from Iraq, and he fled from Iraq with his oldest child, and his wife and 2 younger children. They had to stay in Iraq for various reasons. Mohammed is a car mechanic, and he's been also working in an international organization in Iraq, which helped Kurdish refugees with housing in Iraq. He and his whole family were being persecuted because he also worked as a salesman in the United States military camp. And this resonates what Professor Philipson told about the English and perhaps the fatal reasons to leave. So knowledge of English is not always a good thing and actually can be life-threatening. But this has, of course, political reasons, and being a Sunni Muslim after 2003 has not been perhaps the best choice to live in Iraq. At the Oravais Reception Center, residents received the four lessons per week of Finnish language education, to which they are entitled as asylum seekers. The rest of the weekly hours, 164, they were simply killing time. And Mohammed felt it really difficult to learn Finnish. He had English in his pocket. He knew different dialects of Arabic, also French. But he didn't seem to have any real contact with the language, and the future was nothing but unclear, of course. Would he be able to stay in Finland after all? All residents called Finnish lessons a school, and I think it was a very good name because the teaching methods reminded us researchers and residents from the old school practices. Anyone who is looking at this whiteboard can recognize that it is from a language lesson. I bet you can recognize that. And the content and teaching approach was quite traditional, focusing on grammar, focusing on accuracy, focusing on language that they would never be using. So gaining a membership of society is really complicated without a shared language. And there is a sense that centers residents and the locals live parallel monolingual lives. And it is hardly surprising then that upon receipt of a successful asylum decision, most of the center's residents actively try to find a new home in the Finnish dominant regions. There have been, however, attempts to change the system. In early years, Oravais Reception Center also offered Swedish, but very few residents took part in the lessons. They have internalized the risk discourse that went on and is going on around Swedish. But when we were doing our field work in this reception center, there was a development project in a local educational institution, not far away from reception center. And many adults took part in the course that took about eight weeks or so. Many of them learned to swim, which is, I think, a life skill in Finland at least. The course was very short because the organizers also wanted to give as many people a chance to attend this course as possible. And it was funded by a Finnish foundation called Svenska Kulturfonden. So the private non-governmental organization was actually financing, supporting official bilingualism in Finland instead of the state agency. And Mohammed had a chance to go to this Norvalla course, and he found it really enjoyable. It had some sort of a connection with English that he already knew. But the motivation to go back to the school was, well, it was a kind of an anticlimax, I would say. Gradually, Mohammed felt quite welcoming in Oravais because he had some Swedish in his pocket. And he tried to represent his language use, not just the languages he's been learning, but also the languages that he's been using in various domains. And he quite often described that now I'm feeling human, I'm feeling acknowledged, and I have this kind of a new state of mind. Finnish Immigration Services has a lot to say in funding teaching for the residents, and for lessons it's maximum for teaching Finnish, but to put it bluntly, teaching Finnish at the reception center looks like a perfect exit strategy. And this is in a striking contrast with the situation of quota refugees in the same region, even in the same municipality, who usually start learning Swedish and continue later in Finnish if they wish so. So Finland has also introduced new policy initiatives, but education for asylum seekers is still not a high priority. And the discourses around adult migrant language education are focused on issues on internal security to create and maintain a safe society. This has to do with Islamophobia, for example, and social cohesion. So any language education for asylum seekers has also been interpreted as a waste of resources by the state, both Finnish and Swedish. Nevertheless, a range of linguistic repertoires were available in the daily lives of the residents, including Swedish. Here are the repertoires of the workers of the reception center. There are no German-speaking refugees, but there are people who do know German. So this is one interesting example of how things go forward. Instead of a conclusion, I'd like to present an afterword and I've been telling about how language, and especially Finnish, is used as a proxy for inclusion and exclusion in Mohammed's case. Mohammed and his son received a positive decision on their asylum claim after waiting for 1 year. So now he has entered the integration machinery. He navigated through a very complicated process of family reunification, and his wife and 2 children arrived in Finland in autumn 2017. They're currently living in a bigger bilingual town in the region, and Mohammed made the choice to move from Oravais in order to provide better educational opportunities for his children and get a job for himself. Right after his residence permit, Mohammed was put in an integration training course in Finnish for absolute beginners. So his language lessons were not taken into account at all. So it was a waste of time for 18 months or so. Mohammed has also volunteered in a local charity organization where he uses Finnish and Swedish along with English and Arabic. This is a Finnish Red Cross that he's working in. His children go to a Finnish medium school, and his oldest son plays football in a Swedish football club. So, in sum, Mohammed, with his family members, is living a multilingual everyday life, but is one of the new arrivals who go through a monolingual integration training in an officially bilingual country. What a paradox. Aitäh. Спасибо.
Thank you very much, Sari, and we will come back to these questions discussion is promising to become more and more interesting. So next I would like to invite here Elin Thordardottir. I hope I did it okay. Who is a professor at the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at McGill since 1998. Where she's teaching courses on developmental language disorders in monolingual and bilingual children. And she's doing research on topics of the nature of this disorder, underlying causes, assessment and intervention. She also runs research labs in Montreal and Iceland and lectures regularly at the University of Iceland. And in her talk, she will discuss about the different contextual factors which impact whether language learning becomes more difficult or easy. And these contextual factors include exposure to the language, utility, language policy, identity and attitudes, both by people and the societies. So please, Elin.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. I will be talking about some comparison about research that I do in Montreal and that I do in Iceland. So I've been looking at bilingual kids for quite a few years. And first I was looking at them in Montreal. Montreal is in Quebec, the French-speaking province of Canada. And it is a very unusual linguistic context in that it has two languages that are majority languages. So what I've been focusing on there is looking at kids who speak French and English because they're not immigrants. So we can isolate a number of environmental factors and life factors, socioeconomic factors that influence language learning in immigrants, and we can sort of look at what happens when those are not at play. And then I've been looking at immigrants in Iceland. Iceland has had immigrants only for the last 20 years or so. Before that, we basically didn't have any. So the research that I've done there is on immigrants from various countries. And the reason why I want to show you this work today is because what we find in these two contexts is very different. Very, very different findings. And what I'd like to emphasize today, while there could be many reasons for the differences, are some issues of motivation, utility, identity, and such. So in the work that I've been doing in Montreal for many years, I've been trying to look at how much does the amount of input or the amount of exposure you have to each language, how much does that influence how well you learn that language. And the reason why I need that kind of information is because I'm a speech pathologist. So in my work as a speech pathologist, I often have to try to decide whether children have a language impairment. And for that kind of work, it matters a lot to be able to set an expectation of how much should they have learned given how much opportunity they've had to learn their languages. So what we found in this work in Montreal is that the amount of exposure plays an incredibly strong role. And we've also found that for children to score within the normal range compared to monolinguals, they need a certain critical amount of input of about half of their waking hours. So we find this with preschool children. We basically find that the more the kids are exposed to English, the more they know English, the more they're exposed to French, the more they know French. So kids tend to know either about equal amounts of both languages or more of one language and less of the other. And that has very much to do with simply how much time they've spent in each of their languages. We find the same thing with kids in school age. So this pattern keeps being found for school-age children. And when we compare school-age children, so we have there in the blue, we have simultaneous bilinguals, and the green are sequential bilinguals who start to learn French when they enter school, and the orange kids are monolingual French speakers. So we find that in school age, both simultaneous and sequential bilinguals are still a little bit behind the monolinguals in their French, but they also know another language. And we find that this difference is by about a standard deviation. And if we look at research that's been done in a number of other countries on school-age bilingual children, they tend to score by just about one standard deviation lower than monolingual peers throughout their school years. And so that is because the language that we're looking at here doesn't represent their entire language knowledge. They do also know another language. Now, what we've been doing recently in Quebec is we've been calling these kids that we tested them when they were little kids, and we're calling them and seeing if we can test them again. Now they're adolescents or even young adults. And it's sort of to try to look at the final attainment. Do they ever reach the same level as their monolingual counterparts? And we find that the gap it remains a little bit of a gap, but it does get lesser and lesser. So basically what happens in Quebec is that kids go to school in French. They end up learning French to a very high degree. Now, if we go to Iceland and we look at the immigrants that we've been having, so we started getting mass immigration only about 20 years ago or so, and now we have 15% of the population of immigrant origin. And I did some of the very first studies on these kids, and what we find is incredible variability. And we find that over half of the immigrant children score more than 2 standard deviations below Icelandic peers, even if they've been there for years and years and years. So if you are 2 standard deviations below, so we know that bilinguals are not supposed to score the same as monolinguals, but 2 standard deviation is a huge gap. It means that you may be in grade 8, but you have the language level of a first grader. It means you do not understand what's going on in school. And so this is a situation that is a bit of a disaster, and it is reflected in very, very, very low PISA scores. So Icelandic monolinguals also get very low PISA scores, but the immigrant children get even worse ones. So we know that this does create a communicative difficulty. And another thing that's happening is that the performance is very hard to predict from background variables. So if we look here these lines kind of mean this is the relationship between how much time you've spent in Icelandic since you were born and how rapidly you are increasing your Icelandic skill. And what we can see is that for kids who are in grades 5 and 6 and grades 8 and 9, there is a clear relationship. The more time they spend in school, the more they learn. They do not learn Icelandic fast enough to be like their classmates, but they do learn. However, kids who are just coming into grade 1, so they're starting school, the amount of exposure they've had to Icelandic since birth says nothing about whether they know Icelandic. And the really unbelievable thing about that is that these kids have almost all of them been in Icelandic preschools. They're Icelandic preschools that are the same for everybody. They're run by the city. The kids have been in these preschools, and yet they have not learned Icelandic, even if they were in preschool 8 hours a day for 4 years. So if we're looking at this, we're finding out as we look at this is that many of the preschools are not staffed by Icelandic-speaking people, and so many children are being spoken to in very inconsistent languages throughout their day. So it would be fine if the preschool were in the native language of the child, and they would get very strong in that language. But what's happening is that there are people who they are exposed to multiple languages possibly throughout their day with a lack of consistency. And that's what creates this outcome. Which is, if we look at kids, this graph here is on monolingual children. If we test them on an Icelandic test from grade 1 to grade 10, and we see here in comparison, this is the entire population of immigrant children in Reykjavik over a 2-year period. It's not a sample, it's everybody. And you can see that the variability is huge, and the improvement with age is a lot lesser. It's a lot slower. It's happening, but it's very slow. So why could that be? If we look at the sort of final attainments, so we're looking now at adolescents, what I've done here, this here is L1 speakers, so native speakers. This here is immigrant children. And the blue is their attainment in Icelandic, and the green is English. And the reason why I looked at English in there is because there's a lot of ambient English in Iceland. So kids, even before they have their first English class in school, when they're 9, many of them already have an A2 level of English. They're comfortably conversational. So English is very present, not spoken by people, but spoken by computers and the media and the films and this and that. So what we wanted to look at here, so we keep asking ourselves, do the immigrant kids maybe just not want to learn Icelandic? Are they just banking on English? And what we see here is that the Icelandic native speakers, they definitely do much better in Icelandic than they do in English. Their English scores are sort of -2 standard deviations compared to English monolinguals. I used an American test for this. Whereas the L2 speakers, they do comparably in both languages. And we could not formally measure their own home language, but we did it by self-ratings, and we found out that they speak their 3 languages approximately equally well. So one way to see that is they're trilingual, they're conversationally trilingual. It's pretty impressive the way they speak each of the languages quite comfortably. But they do not have age-appropriate language in any language. They don't have the complex language that you need to have as a teenager. They're about to finish compulsory school, and they're going out there with this kind of language skill. And that, frankly, worries me quite a bit. So if we compare what's happening in Quebec, in contrast, in Quebec, kids have a knowledge of French. The Francophone children may not have, that's the last graph there, they may not necessarily have wonderful grasp of English, but all of the kids, be they immigrant or be they Anglophones or Francophones, they do learn the language of school. So if we try to understand a little bit why we get this difference in these 2 contexts, the linguistic context of Quebec is pretty special. It is, so Quebec is one of 10 Canadian provinces. Canada itself is bilingual. Its official languages are English and French. But in Quebec, French is the sole official language. And French is protected by incredibly strong language policies. It's a law that any immigrant needs to go to school in French. It's downright, there are English schools, but they're only for people of English descent. So what you have there is, if you have a job that has any kind of client contact, so you work at a store, you speak to clients, you have to address them in French. So even in order to have any kind of job that has any client contact, you need to learn French. So we also have a lot of talk about bilingualism because we've had this long-standing rivalry between the French and the English. They've been fighting it out since 1600 and something, right? And they just pretend like the rest of us don't exist. So nobody's talking about immigrants. We just have to all go to school in French. And immigrants do that. They don't talk about it. They just go to school in French. But there's a lot of talk about bilingual identity. People are very aware that they are bilingual or that they're Anglophone or Francophone or Allophone or whatever it is they are. And so there's always a heated political discussion about that, but it's not about the immigrants. Now, if we look at what's happening in Iceland, Icelandic was declared the official language of Iceland only in 2011. Before that, nobody bothered because we've spoken that language there since the year 874, when the first Norse people went to Iceland. And we have very few policies in place. So what happens now is that the schools do not really, they may have a policy of using Icelandic, but a lot of teachers will use English if the kids do not understand them, I think just by instinct. We have a lot of English that is increasingly very visible in the country. But even before that, Icelanders have always been capable of speaking English because we have to take both Danish and English in school. And at the university level, all of our textbooks will be in English or Danish or Swedish or something else because we don't have the manpower to translate them. This may even happen at the high school level. And so all Icelanders basically are able to speak a bit of English. But they have no bilingual identity. So if you say to them, would you be in my study because I'm doing a study on bilingualism? They'll say, sure, but I'm not a bilingual. So they sort of seem to have the idea that bilinguals are only people who were born with 2 languages and that they're not part of that. There's a very interesting book which I think is interesting not only to Icelanders. This is an edited book about research on the status of English in Iceland. So it's a number of doctoral dissertations that look at English use, English policy, English proficiency. And basically what they talk about is the fact that Icelandic people, even children, gain a lot of proficiency in English, as I said, even before they go to school. They feel like they know English pretty well. We have policies that are similar to those in the Nordic countries where we encourage English use in a lot of businesses, in the university, etc. But at the other side of this, which they talk about a lot in the book, is that we're not that good at English. So even though we think we can do all these things, we actually can't. So that, when we talk very nonchalantly about, allowing English use in the universities, it turns out that our university students are barely capable of reading scientific articles in English. So there is this sort of two-sided, the two sides of the coin in this respect. Now, if I talk a little bit about the policies that we have a hard time in Iceland setting policies about how to deal with our languages. So, for example, it's very common now if you go to a restaurant in Reykjavik that you're spoken to only in English. And if you compare that to Quebec, where that's simply against the law, in Iceland, nobody wants to say anything about it. And what we get in the discussion is that this is an example of, there was a court order that a company was, it was deemed by a judge that a company was allowed to ask of their employees that they speak some minimal level of Icelandic. It was a company of vans, like people who are kind of taxi drivers who transport stuff. And reliably, when that happens, there is a certain paper in Iceland that will immediately call this kind of decision racist. So they will say racism doesn't ask for facts. And what that does is that it's hard to have a real discussion about language policy, because if it involves anything like wanting to ensure that people learn Icelandic, somebody will call it racist right away. There's also been propositions to make Polish a second official language of Iceland, because Polish people now make up 5% of the population. Whereas other people, this is a Polish member of parliament, and he says he doesn't think it's time for that yet, but he thinks maybe we should start to translate all of our legislation into English. So there are discussions of that nature. Meanwhile, we have these are two very prominent people in Iceland. This is a very prominent novelist, and this is a professor at the University of Iceland. And they have been saying publicly now that they fear for the Icelandic language. They fear that the Icelandic language, which is spoken only by 330,000 people, they fear that with all the English in the country, young people, all this English speaking may be hurting even young children's learning of Icelandic. And what is very interesting to me about that is that these two people, they were in the papers maybe 10 years ago saying, relax everybody, it's normal for languages to change, don't worry about it. Well, they've changed their tune. And so one more thing I wanted to show you about this is that what I've been doing about this is looking at young people's attitudes. So what we look here at, I used an attitude questionnaire that was originally made by Colin Baker that has been used to look at people's attitudes towards languages. It has been used also in the Basque country to see whether young people are motivated to learn Basque or English or Spanish. And what we find both in Iceland and in Quebec is that attitudes towards both languages, that is Icelandic and English or French and English, they're very high. But the L2 speakers have attitudes that are a little bit higher towards English than to the other languages. And what we did in Iceland is that we did qualitative interviews with young kids, that is adolescents. So the adolescents that I showed you the results before with their Icelandic and their English, we did qualitative interviews with them where we asked them, is it hard to learn Icelandic? Because Icelanders are very often heard saying, you can't ask people to learn Icelandic, that would be crazy, because it's impossible to learn that language with the case marking and everything, can't be done. So we asked the kids, do you think it's hard? Is it hard to learn Icelandic? We asked the L2 speakers. And the native speakers, we asked them, do you think it's hard? And then we asked them, is it important? Should everybody learn Icelandic? And is it important to learn English? And what are your plans for the future? And so this is a qualitative study. We did a thematic analysis, but because I am very quantitatively minded, it's kind of a mixed design. So we also counted up how many kids said what, and that's what I'll show you here to make it quick. So basically, this is the L1 speakers here, this is the L2 speakers. So for each of these things, we counted up how many meaning units in each theme were offered and how many people offered them. And by doing that, we can see that when we ask kids, is it hard to learn Icelandic? The L2 speakers, 11 of them said that it was hard, so half of them said that it was hard, and they could name 17 different reasons. When we asked the Icelandic kids, do you think it's hard? 20 of them, or 84%, said it was hard, and they could name 27 different reasons why they thought it was. So really, and they also had a lot of ideas about why it would be hard, whether it's hard because when you're younger, when you're older, depending which language you come from, all kinds of ideas and speculations about why that might be horribly hard. Whereas the L1 speakers, they were like, yeah, okay, it's okay. No idea about that. So I think I have to skip the actual comments, but when we asked them, is Icelandic important? Do you think it's important? And you can see that in both groups, 75% of the participants said, yes, it's important. It's very important to learn it. And both of the groups, they named issues of utility. They said, well, because it's spoken here, that's what we speak. And many of the L2 speakers said, well, of course it doesn't help you if you go to another country, but I'm here right now, so I'm going to speak Icelandic. All of the kids mentioned utility, but there were also issues of language preservation, of culture, etc. Those were mentioned only by the native Icelandic speakers, which I think is normal, and I think is likely that the L2 speakers have those kinds of feelings towards their own native languages. But what is really interesting to me here is when we pushed these kids and we said, so it's important to learn Icelandic. Do you think that all kids in Iceland should learn Icelandic? The L2 speaker said yes. They should, yes, it's very important. So that you can have jobs, so that you can go to school, so that you can talk to people. Definitely, we need to learn Icelandic. But the Icelandic speaking, the native speakers, they were more likely to say something like, well, it's better for people. It's definitely better. If people are in school, it's definitely better. But, they shouldn't be made to do it. No, I don't think they should be made to do it. No. So you can see what's going on is sort of a well-meaning, it's very well-meaning, and it shows a lot of respect for the fact that the other kids have other home languages. But at the same time, I think this is the similar thing as what we get in the discussion where everybody's calling each other a racist, is that we hesitate to enforce this language because it has such a low value on a global scheme. So you see one thing is common about the French in Quebec and the Icelandic in Iceland is that they are the language of the community or their respective communities. They are the majority language of their communities, but they are a minority language on a more global scale. And in Quebec, they don't hesitate to just say, you're going to learn this, or if you're going to be here, you learn it. In Iceland, nobody wants to really say that. And we see that even in the adolescents. So we also asked them about English. English, they wanted to learn simply for utility. So it wasn't because they thought it was cooler or easier or anything. They said, well, I might want to travel. I need to talk to foreigners, etc. So it was nothing more than that. And we asked them about their future plans, and I found that was very interesting. They said in both groups, kids had plans to stay in Iceland. A lot of them said they would go to other countries, maybe to study. Many of the girls had plans to go to New York and go to Juilliard and act on Broadway. You must have seen a movie on that very recently. But when we questioned them about if you were not to live in Iceland, where would you live? A lot of them said stuff like Britain, New Zealand, or whatever, but they did not say the country of origin of their parents. So basically, both of the groups had very ambitious plans. They were going to study, they were going to travel, they were going to settle down and have great lives. And this is why it worries me that the kids who are the L2 speakers, we're seeing them having trilingual performance with no language being definitely very strong, because that is not the kind of language knowledge that will allow you to go to secondary education. And there are interview studies in Iceland where L2 speakers have described what they had to go through once they were done with compulsory education. Those who continue, those who really have the self-confidence to actually take on further education in Iceland, they say that they spend the first years doing math and those kinds of things that are not language heavy before they can tackle their language heavy subjects. And so this is something where I think that we've talked a lot about the good aspects of multilingualism. And of course, it is a great skill to be able to speak 3 languages, but it does take time to learn languages. And we talk a lot about if you have strong skills in a language, then you can learn more languages. But if the policy of where you're learning your languages doesn't make sure that you get strong skills in at least one language, you end up with these scattered skills that do not actually prepare you for what's to come. And so I think that what is really interesting to me here is that what is holding back policymaking is the lack of ability to have a frank discussion. The discussion always stops by somebody calling somebody, aren't you being too much of a patriot, or aren't you being a racist? And the conversation stops there, because there's no answer to that. And I also think it's really interesting that it is the Icelandic native speakers who, in their mind, will not sort of enforce the learning of this language because they think it's so hard and so useless, whereas the L2 speakers were of a different opinion. So, thank you.
Thank you, Elin, and please come straight. And
Okay.
I would like to invite Nayr and Sari to join me and Elin up the stage. We still have about 10 minutes to sum up our discussion, and I'm really fascinated by these all three talks, and I think they raise a number of very significant questions. So I was planning to say it later, but since Elin drew attention to the question of small language sustainability and small language protection, I would like to ask opinion of all of you. So a lot of monolingual policies in education or in societies are motivated by understanding or belief that if this is not the place where we cherish this language and protect it and develop it, then where else? So, and this is a challenge, especially for small languages, especially for Estonia, for Finland. Although you're larger, but still your Finnish language is specific and unique enough for Iceland especially. At the same time, our world is increasingly multilingual, and we cannot just blindly close our eyes and say that we protect our language and we ignore multilingualism of the global world, because by that we actually clip our wings or wings of our children if they do not grow up in understanding of the value of multilingualism, or if they grow up without the multilingual skills. So is there a way to balance these two realities? Who wants to start?
Well,
is there an answer?
I can start with what I think is that, first of all, Icelandic is my language, and I would not like to see it die, and that is a possibility. That is talked about more and more. But what I have been saying in Iceland about this is that making sure Icelandic is the language of the country. If you want to have a job other than working at the gas station or in a restaurant, you do have to know Icelandic. So if you don't know it, you limit your opportunities. And I think that making sure that L2 speakers, children, that they learn Icelandic, it is not taking something away from them. It is making them capable of having equal opportunities in the country where they plan to live. And that does not mean that they cannot continue to speak their own languages. And the policy in Iceland is very supportive of home languages to the detriment of Icelandic. Yeah.
Okay. Nayr?
I think multilingualism is also context dependent, isn't it? And I think in this, I think we need to look at the context when we're looking at language policy, when you're looking at which languages you're going to learn and which languages you're going to support. And I think in any kind of context where you're a newly arrived individual in a particular context, I think it is important to learn that language. So it is important to learn Icelandic in Iceland or Norwegian in Norway. And from a multilingual perspective, that's actually a very positive thing, because developing multilingualism means that you're adding another bow or another string to your bow, if you want to say that. So I think it's great. So I think this is an example of going to the other extreme, where you're so open to other languages that you're not actually supporting your own language.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see as well that the L2 students were actually a lot more positive about learning Icelandic and understood the need for learning Icelandic as opposed to the the other individual. So I think it is context dependent, but I think the language of the context is an important language in a multilingual's repertoire.
Okay.
There's a lot to say about this topic, of course, but I would perhaps start with what are the resources for these kids? What is the teacher education? What does it look like? Are there enough resources and knowledge and further education for in-service teachers? So now it's kind of it feels like an individual problem, actually, that, okay, they don't know enough, so that's why they are lacking certain knowledge, certain skills, and they're behind those who are perhaps the native speakers. And I hear these PISA results, and of course in Finland it has its own PISA heaven, but there have been lower results in Swedish medium schools, and you know what? So they are blaming bilinguals for these lower results. And I would like to ask, what are the pedagogical activities over there? And how are these languages in the lives of schools, and how is kids' multilingualism used, not just acknowledged that, okay, nice, you speak Arabic and French, but how is it used in order to make them to progress? And these types of attempts have been in various countries. There's a saying that even dead things left unused die. So I'd like to ask that do we really want to leave certain languages dead? In Finland, for example, there's a growing worriness about Finnish, not about Swedish.
Not Sami? Finnish?
Sami is a special case, and being an indigenous, but in these, when talking about English as an elephant in the room, it's always threatening Finnish, but not Swedish. Swedish is put aside in these conversations and debates. So I call it as a new nationalism, actually.
So, was there a question to Elin?
Well, if I do pick up on what you said about what's being done in Iceland, what's being done is highly inconsistent, because this thing just happened without anybody having expected it. So people were not, at the beginning, we had no specifically trained teachers to deal with this. So it was kind of the Wild West. But another thing also is that both in Iceland and Quebec, the number of other languages is about 150. So some of those languages, there's a considerable community, like Polish speakers they're the largest immigrant group. So you can do something, there's a Polish school, etc. For some of the communities, there is nothing. So what in the positive view of home languages is to the point in Iceland that people are being told, and you can find this in policy documents, they're being told that if the child doesn't learn to speak, to read in their home language, in their mother tongue, which is so-called rather than heritage language over there, then they will never learn to read. And there are people who are the only family from certain countries who are noticed that they're not capable of teaching their child their own language to that point, and they are just devastated. So there is, and there is need for a frank discussion of really what is possible.
I think, can I just say, I also think there's a lot of research taking place into bilingualism, into multilingualism, into how the brain manages languages, into how the individual manages languages, and I think we really need that to come out and out into the public. I think parents need training. Parents need to understand how languages function. Teachers need a lot more training in how to manage the different linguistic resources in the classroom. So there's a lack of understanding of how that functions. I mean, it could be because we just tend to look at language and language policies very monolingually. It could be just simply because we're not disseminating these, we're not informing the public of how it actually functions and all the different resources and the different strategies and techniques that you can use in the classroom to help manage the different languages.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think we need to also acknowledge that you have limited time and you need a certain number of waking hours to learn a language. And the more you try to learn many of them at the same time, the more you spread yourself thin. And there may be choices to make. So people, families, or schools may need to focus, may need to deliberately decide that you're going to learn your languages in sequence, or that you're going to learn one of them at least that becomes your strongest, and a number of other ones in the rest of your time. You cannot learn 4 or 5 languages and speak all of them to age-appropriate levels that allow you to get an education. You just don't have time for that. And I think we know that from quite a bit of research.
I have such great discussions that I don't need to ask questions. Please.
I'd like to also point out that when we are talking about home languages, actually it creates a space for using languages only at home. So it has its own limited domain. And that's a bit also, it's one aspect of it. And especially when I'm also thinking about general attitudes and the language climate in countries like Finland, for example. In the late 80s, in early 90s, if you were in public places and a Russian speaker, it was better to whisper in public places.
Yeah.
But now it's Arabic.
Okay.
So Arabic is a no-go language. And what does it do to families and the mental state of these kids? That's my question.
I have one specific question for Elin. Based on your experience, is there any concrete specific recommendation on how to avoid methodologically in a multilinguistic educational context to avoid this spreading thing? In trying to obtain several different languages at the same time. Because as they say, there are various ways of being bilingual or trilingual, but there are some ways where you become more efficient in actually succeeding.
So there are two things that are being tried in Iceland. One of them is there's a strong push towards having mother tongues in the schools. So taking part of the school day and teaching them in the mother tongue. That is very difficult to do in all 150 languages. The other one is to make the school very strongly Icelandic speaking. The school day is quite short in Iceland, and to try to add more extracurricular activities that are in Icelandic to try to make Icelandic a strong language. Okay. So these are two things that are being proposed.
Thank you. I would like to bring one more elephant in the room, and it is identity or cultural identity. So if we speak about language, language is a very significant element of cultural identity. So if people are multilingual, what are the links between their multilingual identity and their multicultural identity? And as I understand, a lot of opposition from the public towards multilingualism is a perception that if I become bilingual, I become less of somebody in one of my ethnic belonging. If I am an Estonian speaking English, I am less of an Estonian. If I'm a Russian speaking Estonian or learning in Russian, I am less of a Russian. But how to overcome this fear of cultural threat from education system or from people coming into the country? What would be the arguments of overcoming it and actually proving that it is enriching? Or how to make sure that it is enriching and that those fears do not realize?
Okay, that's very complex. I'm not sure
we have 7 seconds to
that
respond.
question, but I would just like to first say that because of how individuals pick up languages and learn languages today, I'm not sure we can really link a language identity to a culture, to a cultural identity. The link isn't as obvious as that. So I was brought up in South Africa. I've got English. Now, what is my English identity? It's not British. It's not American. So we need to deconnect, I think, that strong link from language and identity, but at the same time we still need to maintain it, and that's why it's so complex, because if I do want to learn my mother tongue, then that strong identity link is there. So I think that this conversation is much more complex than just simply saying that, yes no. It's a yes or no situation. Yep. It's very, very much also a choice of the individual and how they actually want to use their languages and how they want to present their languages at that particular moment in time, for example. So it's a very difficult discourse, but it's a very easy discourse that politicians use against or for their own purposes. Yep. And that is the unfortunate thing about language and identity.
Yeah. It creates a certain non-belongingness. And it also has an institutional suspicion towards multilingual people, as if they wouldn't be loyal to their country, which is really worrisome. And I once asked a colleague of mine who said that, yeah, we Irish people, we also have ethnicity. And I said, well, what's your ethnicity coming from Northern Ireland? I said, I'm ethnically Catholic. So it's not always about language, and it's always about language, how we speak about these identities and how we treat each other, and that's it.
I would just like to say to that, I find that in a number of talks it's been assumed that the view of multilingualism is negative, that people are scared of it. In Iceland, I can't see that view. In Quebec, I really do not see that view. Allophones are highly trilingual. And I have always been an immigrant almost all my life. My children are. In the circles that I move, I just do not see this. I don't think everybody is scared of this. Really.
And yet some people are.
Yeah, but many people are not. So we can't always assume also that's always the case.
There are different multilingualisms.
Okay. I would love to invite some more questions, but we are already like 5. Can we take one from there? One, okay. So.
Thank you so much for this question. I'm Mayank from ISEC. And I want to make sure that the whole panel session or discussion that we had, at least we as delegates, we can at least bring back something to our organization or influence. So I wanted to know, maybe like not now, after 10 years, I'm sure that I will be able to contribute something for the humanity. And this integration conference maybe adds certain touch points that I can start preparing now, and after 10 years, I'll be able to do something. And similarly, some of my friends can do it. So question here is, as Sanita in the previous session, she mentioned that humankind, we need language for survival. So survival to cooperation, communication is a touch point that where we bring the language. Now question comes here that after globalization, what we can do, maybe individually or as a part of organizations, what we can do to maintain optimum balance in the cost and benefit for multilingualism. So I don't know what I can do to maintain the right, because I don't even know what is the right thing.
Okay.
So I want to educate myself.
So the question is, what is the best we can do to maintain the balance between multilingualism or within multilingualism in the globalized society? Yes?
Okay.
Perhaps,
Well, perhaps we need to look at each individual context and ensure that we are doing the right thing for that particular context and the people in that particular context, and not think that we're going to use the same approaches across the board, because that just doesn't work.
okay.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that what is lacking in the Icelandic context is the right type of opportunity. It's like the making some policy and trying to make sure that people can learn all the languages that they need in their life, and that they can go about it in a way that gives them good functional skill.
Okay.
I've been thinking that instead of talking about what kind of target levels people would have in order to learn languages, I would ask every one of us how much are we doing in order to enhance well-being. So is language education actually done in order to make people feeling well? And that would be a perhaps new step towards better pedagogies as well, and policies.
If I may, I would also perhaps add a question of respect. Each language has a story behind it. It has a group of people behind it. So respecting this language and embracing it would also help us to keep this balance between being all international, but also respecting the local. Okay, so perhaps that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much for discussion. Thank you.